Rod Ovid here with another Take 5, something that we bring to you every Monday through Saturday on our Facebook page for Rod Ovid and again on the Logos Institute of Biblical Studies. Today I want to begin a two-part study on an event that happened in David's life. It was during the pursuit that Saul had toward him. It was an odd situation. It was a very tough situation for David. Very confusing, would be confusing to anyone, and I would like us to carefully look through it. And I'd like us to take our glasses of cynicism and put them aside for a moment. We live in a cynical world. We don't believe things. We have to see it to believe it. We don't trust things, and there's some justification for those thoughts, but when it comes to God, we need to know that we're working with something that is absolute, something that is the final authority, a God that is in charge and actually needs nothing, a God who is complete unto himself. And when he shows us favor, it's grace. And we need to lay aside the cynicism and the skepticism and the haughtiness that we sometimes harbor in our thoughts when we come to him, because he knows our thoughts anyway. So I think you'll find this an interesting little trip back into history, and I invite you to join me, and perhaps after listening to it you can invite others to hear it. But this is an important message. It's found in 1 Samuel 24, beginning at verse 1. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and the men were far back in the cave. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give you your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now I want you to imagine this scene for a minute. David had already been anointed king. He knew God was going to bless him. He had already lived in the big house. He had lived in the palace. He was beginning to understand all the headiness, all the hierarchy, all the politics involved, because they modeled it after an Eastern monarchy, and kings had absolute authority, and there was all types of power struggles at the top. And David saw this, and he knew that someone was advising Saul that David was trading out to the Philistines, that David somehow had plotted against Saul to have him killed by the Philistines where he could take over, and that just wasn't true. So here's Saul pursuing the Philistines, an ongoing war, by the way, between the Philistines and Israel, and the Philistines were quite massive. They were called the boat people. They came over from lower Greece, and they went to Egypt and then went to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, and they would come up into the area there. And there was actually 5 tribes of the Philistines, and when you fought one portion, you fought them all. They were rather formidable. And they were ironsmiths. They were excellent at making the armament of war, and they were a challenge. And so it says that Saul immediately, upon hearing where David was, took 3,000 of his choice men, 3,000, and went out to look for David. Now that makes me frightened just hearing of it. 3,000 hand-picked soldiers coming at you. So as it would happen, there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. I think we all know what that means. He went in to use it for a bathroom. And David's men were back in the cave, and they heard the commotion. They were real quiet, and they saw that it was Saul, and they couldn't believe it. Now these were rough men David had. They were outlaws. They were misfits. They were rough and tough, and not all of them knew God the way David did. But they respected David, and he took good care of them, and they were loyal. And in their logic, they saw this as an opening that they should take, should jump on it. They looked at it as a good omen, as good luck, as God's favor. And naturally, David could end it all right there and then. walk out with the head of Saul in his hand just like he did Goliath. And yet David does not do it. He creeps up unnoticed, could have thrust that knife right into Saul, but instead he cuts off a corner of his robe, then backs off. It says in verse 5, afterward David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe, and said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. And with these words David rebuked his men, and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Now that in and of itself was a godsend. I do not know how David held these men together, how he did not suffer mutiny. It was a God thing. They listened to him, and it was totally unnatural for them to do that. They were fighting men. They were men on the run. They had no love for Saul, and they saw this as a golden opportunity to turn things in their favor. Now, do you think you could stop them? But David, as usual, spoke up his conscience, spoke for the Lord, said it with authority, and God backed his play. And so there he sits with a piece of the robe in his hand, and he doesn't let anything happen to Saul. Now, we're going to pick this up again tomorrow, and I invite you to join us. There's a lot more to this story. I think you'll enjoy it. But we need to consider being quiet occasionally, listening for God, watch him work, and be loyal to our conscience and to those things we know that are right. When we can start doing that, our days will become blessed.